Some folks run from their past, while others think they've buried it deep enough to forget. Eli Rourke spent 15 years believing the mountains of Wyoming had given him peace at last. The 73-year-old trapper lived alone with his dog Buck in the high country, where the silence felt like forgiveness and every sunrise promised a fresh start. His cabin sat tucked away from the world that had once broken his heart and his faith in justice. But when an autumn storm brought down a rockslide near Devil's Canyon, Buck started digging like his life depended on it. What they found beneath those stones was a rusted sheriff's badge, a skeleton's bony grip on an old revolver, and a journal with Eli's name written inside. How could a dead man know his name, and why did the handwriting look so familiar? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after the discovery, Eli sat on his cabin porch with a steaming cup of coffee, watching Buck nose around the Rockslide site with the persistence of a creature who knew secrets lived beneath stone and earth. At 73, Eli had learned to read the land like scripture. Every ridge told a story, every creek sang its history, and every storm left messages in the arrangement of fallen timber and shifted stone. But this particular message felt written specifically for him, and that troubled his soul more than he cared to admit. Buck was a good dog, the kind that understood a man's need for quiet without taking it personal. The German Shepherd mix had wandered into Eli's life 7 years ago, half-starved and carrying scars that spoke of hard times. Neither of them had needed words to recognize kindred spirits. They'd built a life together in the high country, where the nearest neighbor lived 3 valleys over, and the only visitors were the occasional lost hiker or wandering elk. Eli's cabin sat at 8,000 feet, tucked into a grove of ancient pines that had weathered more storms than most folks saw troubles. He'd built it himself, log by log, with hands that remembered the weight of tools and the satisfaction of honest work. The structure was simple but solid. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows positioned to catch the morning light and the evening's last golden hour. Solar panels provided modest electricity, while a creek that never ran dry supplied fresh water year-round. It was everything a man needed, and nothing he didn't. The life suited him. Every morning brought familiar routines that anchored him to purpose, checking his trap lines, splitting wood, tending to his small garden, and maintaining the equipment that kept him independent. Evenings were for reading by lamplight, whittling, or simply sitting with Buck and listening to the mountain's conversation with the wind. It was a life measured not in deadlines or obligations, but in seasons and weather patterns, in the migration of deer and the flowering of mountain lupine. But 15 years ago, life had looked entirely different. Eli reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a faded photograph, its edges soft with handling. The young man in the deputy's uniform looked confident in a way that seemed almost foreign now. Star pinned to his chest, hand resting on his service weapon, eyes bright with the certainty that justice mattered and that good men could make a difference. That was Deputy Eli Rourke of Cedar Ridge, Wyoming Territory. Back when he believed the law was a shield for the innocent and a sword for the righteous. The photograph had been taken in 1878, just after Sheriff McKinnon had pinned the deputy's star to his chest. McKinnon, now there was a man who'd shaped Eli's understanding of what it meant to serve. Tall and weathered, with eyes that missed nothing, and a voice that could be gentle as rain or hard as granite, depending on what the moment required. He'd taken a green kid from the mountains and taught him that being a lawman meant more than wearing a badge and carrying a gun. It meant standing between fear and safety, between chaos and order, between the wolves and the sheep. A deputy's job isn't to win fights, son, McKinnon had told him during those early days. It's to make sure the fights are fair ones. McKinnon had been more than a mentor. He'd been the father Eli never had. The steady presence that guided him through the complexities of law and justice in a territory where both could be scarce as water in drought season. Under McKinnon's guidance, Eli had learned to track men as easily as animals, to read the truth in a suspect's eyes, to know when mercy served justice better than punishment. For 5 years, they'd worked together, cleaning up Cedar Ridge and the surrounding territory. They'd broken up cattle rustling operations, brought in claim jumpers, and maintained the peace in a region where tempers ran hot and guns were settled arguments as often as words. Eli had been good at the work, better than good. He had the mountain man's patience, the hunter's instincts, and the rare ability to see past a man's words to his intentions. Then came Sarah. Eli closed his eyes, letting the memory wash over him like morning light through pine boughs. Sarah Whitmore, the schoolteacher who'd arrived in Cedar Ridge on the spring stage in 1882, carrying nothing but a carpet bag and dreams of bringing education to the frontier. She was educated, refined, with dark hair that caught sunlight and brown eyes that sparkled with intelligence and humor. She should have been completely out of reach for a rough-edged deputy who was more comfortable tracking elk than making conversation at church socials. But somehow, impossibly, she'd seen something in him worth her attention. Their courtship had been gentle and proper, conducted through long walks after church services and conversations that lasted until the evening stars appeared. She'd shared her dreams of building a real school, of bringing books and learning to children who'd never known anything but hard work and harsh weather. He'd shown her the hidden places in the mountains, secret meadows where wildflowers grew in impossible profusion, crystal-clear lakes that reflected the sky like mirrors, vantage points where the whole territory spread out below like God's own. You see beauty where others see only wilderness, she told him one evening as they watched the sunset. Paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. That's a rare gift, Eli. By the winter of 1883, he'd been planning to ask for her hand. McKinnon had given his blessing, even offered to perform the ceremony himself, as he was authorized to do in his capacity as sheriff. Eli had been saving money for a proper ring, imagining a future where Sarah's laughter filled the cabin he planned to build, where their children would learn to love the mountains as much as he did. Then everything had gone to hell. It started with a gold shipment that never made it to Denver. $2,000 in gold dust and nuggets, meant to pay for territorial improvements, had vanished somewhere between the Cedar Ridge mining office and the main road. The investigation had been routine at first. Check the obvious suspects, follow the obvious trails, ask the obvious questions. But as Eli and McKinnon dug deeper, they'd uncovered something that went far beyond simple robbery. The gold hadn't been stolen by road agents or desperate prospectors. It had been taken by men who wore respectable suits and sat on the town council, men who controlled the banks and the mining operations, men who smiled in church on Sunday morning and planned their crimes over brandy and cigars on Sunday evening. McKinnon had been methodical in building his case, collecting evidence piece by piece like a man assembling a jigsaw puzzle. Bank records that didn't match withdrawal slips. Witnesses who'd seen prominent citizens in places they claimed never to have been. Mining claims that had been sold for far less than their value to buyers who happened to be relatives of town officials. Corruptions like rot in timber. McKinnon had explained to Eli as they worked late into the night, organizing documents and witness statements. Once it takes hold, it spreads until the whole structure's compromised. We need to cut it out completely, or it'll just come back stronger. The deeper they dug, the more they found. The gold robbery had been just the beginning. For years, a network of supposedly respectable citizens had been systematically stealing from the territory, skimming money meant for roads and schools and public works, selling information to cattle rustlers and claim jumpers, even taking bribes to look the other way when justice should have been served. At the center of it all was Councilman James Hartwell, a man who'd built his fortune through what everyone assumed was shrewd business sense and hard work. In reality, he'd been the spider at the center of a web that stretched across 3 counties, coordinating crimes and ensuring that evidence disappeared, and witnesses stayed quiet. Eli and McKinnon had been close to making Arrests when the threat started. First it was just words, warnings delivered by men who claimed to be concerned citizens, but whose eyes held the cold promise of violence. Then it escalated. Eli's horse had been found dead in his stable, its throat cut with surgical precision. McKinnon's house had been burned down while he was out on patrol, destroying years of personal belongings and nearly killing his elderly housekeeper. The message was clear. Drop the investigation or face the consequences. But McKinnon hadn't been the kind of man to back down from a fight, especially when justice was at stake. "We're close, son," he'd told Eli just days before everything fell apart. "Another week, maybe 2, and we'll have enough evidence to bring down the whole network. We just need to stay strong a little longer." That was the last conversation they'd ever had. 3 days later, McKinnon had ridden out to follow up on a lead and never come back. His horse had returned riderless, blood on the saddle, but no sign of the sheriff. Search parties had combed the territory for weeks without finding so much as a boot print. It was as if he'd simply vanished into the mountain air. Without McKinnon's guidance and protection, Eli had found himself isolated and vulnerable. The corrupt officials moved quickly to consolidate their power, appointing a new sheriff who was clearly in their pocket. Evidence began disappearing from the jail strongbox. Witnesses suddenly developed selective memory loss. The investigation that had been so close to success crumbled like a house built on sand. Worse yet, Sarah had begun pulling away from him. Their evening walks became less frequent, then stopped altogether. She'd become distant, distracted, claiming she needed time to think about their future. When Eli had finally worked up the courage to ask what was wrong, she delivered the words that still echoed in his heart 15 years later. "I'm sorry. Eli, I've realized I'm not cut out for this kind of life. I need something more stable, more civilized. I've accepted a teaching position back east. The rejection had been devastating, but what made it worse was the timing. Just when he'd needed her support most. When McKinnon's disappearance had left him questioning everything he'd believed about justice and law and the possibility of good triumphing over evil. She'd abandoned him. Within a month, she was gone. Within 3 months, Eli had turned in his badge and headed for the high country, carrying nothing but his pain and a determination never to let the world break his heart again. Now, sitting on his porch with Buck at his feet and that damned journal weighing heavy in his hands, Eli wondered if he'd been running from the truth all these years, or running toward it. Buck whined softly and nudged his master's leg, sensing the turmoil that always accompanied these memories. Eli scratched the dog's ears and let his gaze drift back to the Rockslide site. "What do you think, old boy?" he murmured. "That badge we found, you reckon it might be McKinnon's?" Buck's tail wagged once, tentatively, as if he understood the weight of the question. Eli stood up, his joints protesting the sudden movement, and walked to the edge of his porch. The mountain air was crisp with the promise of winter, carrying the scent of pine and the distant suggestion of snow. In a few weeks, the high passes would be closed, trapping him in his valley until spring's return. If he was going to do something about what they'd found, he needed to do it soon. But what exactly was he planning to do? He was 73 years old, 15 years removed from law enforcement, living as a hermit in the wilderness. What business did he have reopening old wounds and chasing ghosts from his past? The answer lay in the journal, in those impossible entries written in McKinnon's familiar hand. Whatever had happened to his old mentor, whatever secrets were buried beneath that rockslide, they were connected to the corruption that had driven Eli from civilization. And if there was even the slightest chance that justice could still be served, didn't he owe it to McKinnon's memory to try? Eli looked down at Buck, who was watching him with the patient intelligence that had made their partnership so rewarding over the years. "Looks like we might be taking a trip down the mountain, partner," he said quietly. "Question is, are we strong enough for what we might find down there?" Buck's response was to walk to the door of the cabin and sit, waiting for his master to make the decision that would change both their lives forever. The journal felt heavier than it had any right to, its leather binding worn smooth by years of handling. Eli sat at his kitchen table with the artifact spread before him, a kerosene lamp casting dancing shadows across pages that should not exist. Buck lay nearby, ears pricked forward, as if he too sensed the impossibility of what they'd discovered. The handwriting was unmistakably McKinnon's. Eli would have recognized that careful script anywhere. The sheriff had always been particular about his penmanship, believing that clear writing reflected clear thinking. But as Eli read the entries, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air settled into his bones. September 15th, 1883 young, Eli grows restless with the investigation. I can see it in his eyes during our evening planning sessions, the hunger for justice burning so bright it might consume him if we're not careful. He doesn't yet understand that patience is a lawman's greatest weapon. Time reveals what haste conceals. The corruption runs deeper than we first suspected. Hartwell is merely the visible head of something far more sinister. Tonight I discovered evidence linking the gold theft to territorial officials in Cheyenne. This isn't just local greed, it's organized crime, with reach far beyond Cedar Ridge. Eli's hands trembled slightly as he turned the page. The entry was dated just 2 days before McKinnon's disappearance, yet it described conversations and discoveries that had happened exactly as written. How could McKinnon have predicted Eli's thoughts with such accuracy? September 17th, 1883, Sarah Whitmore came to see me today, and what she revealed changes everything. She's been receiving threats, not the crude intimidation they've been using on Eli and me, but something far more sophisticated. Someone has been watching her, learning her routines, documenting her vulnerabilities. They know she represents Eli's greatest weakness. She's terrified, but more for Eli than herself. She's convinced they'll use her to force him to abandon the investigation. I fear she may be considering leaving town to protect him, not understanding that her departure would wound him more deeply than any physical threat. I've tried to convince her to trust in our ability to protect her, but she sees too clearly how outmatched we are. The corruption has tentacles in places we haven't even discovered yet. Eli's throat constricted. Sarah hadn't left because she'd stopped caring. She'd left because she'd been afraid. All these years, he'd carried the weight of her rejection, never knowing she'd been trying to protect him. September 18th, 1883, tomorrow. I ride to investigate the Morrison mine. Eli wants to come, but I've ordered him to stay in town and continue organizing our evidence. I have a feeling this lead will break the case wide open, but also that it may be the most dangerous thing I've ever attempted. If something happens to me, I pray Eli will have the wisdom to preserve himself rather than seek vengeance. He's a good man with a lawman's heart, but he's young enough to confuse justice with retribution. The mountain has always called to him. Perhaps it would offer him the peace that civilization seems determined to deny. I've hidden copies of all our evidence in several locations throughout the territory. If the worst happens, perhaps someday these secrets will find their way to someone brave enough to finish what we started. The entries stopped there, but somehow the journal wasn't empty. As Eli turned to the next page, his breath caught in his throat. More writing appeared in the same careful hand. But the dates were impossible. October 16th, 1898, 15 years have passed since my death. Yet somehow I observe from this strange between place where time flows differently. Eli has built himself a good life in the high country, but I see how the weight of unsolved mysteries burdens his heart. Buck is a faithful companion, the kind of dog every mountain man needs. The corruption we fought so hard to expose has only grown stronger in our absence. Hartwell's network now extends into railroad contracts, federal land grants, and territorial appointments. They've grown confident in their impunity, careless in their methods. This may finally be their undoing. Eli pushed back from the table, his rational mind rejecting what his eyes were reading. Dead men didn't write journals. They didn't observe the living or comment on the passage of years. Yet there it was, in McKinnon's unmistakable script, describing Eli's current life with impossible accuracy. The Rockslide was no accident, old friend. The mountain itself grows weary of keeping secrets. What lies beneath is more than just my remains. It's the evidence we need to finally bring justice to those who thought themselves beyond its reach. Trust your instincts, as you always have. Trust Buck's nose and your own mountain wisdom. But most of all, trust that some fights are worth finishing, even 15 years after they began. Buck suddenly rose to his feet, ears alert and facing the cabin's front door. A low growl rumbled in his throat, not the warning bark he used for wildlife, but the deeper sound reserved for human threats. Eli quietly closed the journal and moved to the window, staying low and to one side as he peered through the glass. At first, he saw nothing unusual. The afternoon shadows stretched long across his clearing, and the forest beyond looked peaceful in the fading light. But Buck's instincts had never failed him, and Eli had learned to trust the dog's senses over his own aging eyes and ears. Then he spotted it, a brief glint of reflected light from the tree line. There and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. Binoculars most likely, or possibly a rifle scope. Someone was watching his cabin, had probably been watching for some time. Eli's old training kicked in automatically. He moved through his cabin with practiced stealth, gathering essential supplies without creating obvious signs of preparation. His rifle went into its travel case, ammunition into his pack, along with dried food and basic survival gear. The journal he wrapped carefully in oiled cloth before securing it in his shirt. Buck watched these preparations with intelligent eyes, understanding without words that danger had found their sanctuary. When Eli moved toward the back door, the dog fell into position beside him, ready to follow wherever his master led. They slipped out through the cabin's rear exit, using the building itself to screen their movement from whoever was watching the front. Eli's knowledge of the terrain served him well. He knew every boulder, every deadfall, every natural hiding place within a mile of his home. Moving like shadows, they worked their way through the forest toward a position where Eli could observe his watchers. It took 20 minutes of careful stalking, but eventually he spotted them. 3 men positioned in the tree line, dressed in hunting clothes, but carrying themselves with the disciplined alertness of professionals. They weren't local hunters or casual visitors. These were men who'd been sent to find him, but how had they known where to look? Eli's cabin was isolated, unmarked on any official map, accessible only by trails he'd cut himself. In 15 years of mountain living, he'd had perhaps a dozen unexpected visitors, and most of those had been genuinely lost hikers. The answer lay in the timing. The Rockslide had been just yesterday, the discovery of McKinnon's remains less than 24 hours ago. Yet already, someone had tracked him to his remote sanctuary. That suggested a level of organization and resources that went far beyond local corruption. As if responding to his thoughts, one of the watchers raised a hand to his ear, a radio or some other communication device. Modern technology in the hands of men who'd somehow learned about yesterday's discovery. The implications were chilling. Eli watched long enough to confirm they were settling in for an extended surveillance operation, then began his withdrawal. Moving with the patience McKinnon had taught him decades ago, he and Buck made their way to a secondary cache he'd established years earlier. Hidden beneath a carefully constructed rock pile, emergency supplies waited for exactly this kind of situation. By the time full darkness fell, Eli had retrieved his backup gear and established a cold camp in a cave overlooking his valley. From this vantage point, he could monitor his cabin and observe the watcher's activities without revealing his own position. As he settled in for what would likely be a long night, Eli opened the journal once more, using a small flashlight to read by the cave's deeper shadows. The men who hunt you now are the same breed who silenced me 15 years ago. They've grown comfortable in their power, confident that age and isolation have made you harmless. They're about to learn how wrong they are. The path forward won't be easy, old friend. Justice delayed is not justice denied, but it does require a different kind of courage. Are you ready to become the hunter instead of the hunted? Eli closed the journal and looked down at Buck, whose eyes reflected the flashlight's dim glow. The dog's expression was alert but calm, ready to follow wherever this new path might lead. Looks like our quiet retirement just came to an end, partner, Eli whispered. Question is, do we still remember how to be dangerous? Buck's tail wagged once softly, and Eli smiled for the first time since the discovery. Maybe they were both older than they used to be, but the mountain had taught them patience, and 15 years of survival had kept their instincts sharp. The watchers below thought they were hunting a helpless old hermit. They were about to discover their mistake. The brass compass caught the moonlight as Eli turned it over in his weathered hands, its needle pointing steadily towards Cedar Ridge, despite the magnetic interference that should have come from the surrounding iron ore deposits. McKinnon's initials were etched into the back RJM for Robert James McKinnon, along with a date that made Eli's chest tighten. June 15, 1878, his graduation day from the Territorial Law Enforcement Academy. Eli remembered that compass well. McKinnon had carried it everywhere, consulting it not just for direction, but as a kind of talisman, a reminder that true north existed, even when the world seemed determined to lead a man astray. A lawman's job is to be a compass for his community, McKinnon had often said. Point toward justice, no matter how strong the forces trying to pull you off course. From his cave overlooking the valley, Eli watched the three watchers maintain their vigil around his cabin. They'd been there all night, taking shifts with military precision, confirming his suspicion that these weren't ordinary hired guns. Their discipline spoke of professional training, possibly military or law enforcement backgrounds. The kind of men who wouldn't give up easily once they'd been set on a trail. Buck lay pressed against Eli's side, sharing warmth in the mountain's cold embrace. The dog's breathing was steady and calm, but Eli could feel the coiled tension in his muscles. Buck understood they were being hunted, and his loyalty ran deep enough that he'd follow Eli into whatever danger lay ahead. Sleep had been impossible. Every time Eli closed his eyes, memories flooded back with painful clarity. McKinnon's patient voice explaining the finer points of evidence collection. The pride in the sheriff's eyes when Eli successfully tracked down his first fugitive. The way McKinnon had treated him like a son, filling the void left by a father who died in a mining accident when Eli was barely 16. The compass needle's unwavering direction towards Cedar Ridge felt like an accusation. For 15 years, Eli had convinced himself that leaving had been the right choice, the only choice. McKinnon was dead. Sarah was gone. The corruption was too deep to root out. What could one broken deputy accomplish against forces that had already claimed his mentor? But now, with the journal's impossible revelations and the presence of watchers who'd found him with disturbing speed, Eli was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Maybe he hadn't been protecting himself by retreating to the mountains. Maybe he'd been protecting the corrupt officials who'd murdered his mentor and destroyed his faith in justice. The thought gnawed at him as dawn approached, painting the eastern peaks in shades of rose and gold. How many crimes had gone unpunished while he nursed his wounds in isolation? How many victims had been denied justice because the one man who knew the truth had chosen silence over action? As if sensing his internal turmoil, Buck raised his head and nuzzled Eli's hand. The simple gesture of comfort from his faithful companion helped steady his racing thoughts. He wasn't the same man who'd fled Cedar Ridge 15 years ago. The mountains had taught him patience, endurance, and the kind of practical wisdom that came from surviving in an unforgiving environment. If anything, exile had made him stronger, not weaker. The watchers below began stirring as morning light reached their position. Eli observed them through his binoculars, noting their equipment and movements. Professional-grade communications gear, high-end rifles, clothing and boots that suggested unlimited resources. This wasn't some local operation. Somebody with serious money wanted him found. One of the men raised his radio and spoke briefly. Eli couldn't hear the words, but the man's posture suggested he was receiving orders rather than giving them. After the conversation ended, two of the watchers began breaking down their surveillance position, while the third maintained observation of the cabin. Eli made his decision with the finality that had served him well in dangerous situations. Running deeper into the mountains might buy him time, but it wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. Whoever had sent these men would keep sending more until they found what they wanted. The only way to end this was to discover why they'd come looking for him in the first place. That meant returning to Cedar Ridge and confronting the past he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. But first, he needed to lose his current shadows. The mountains were his element, and these men, skilled as they might be, were operating in his territory now. Eli began planning a route that would take advantage of every geographical feature he'd learned during his years of isolation. The path he chose led through some of the most treacherous terrain in the territory. Rocky ledges where a single misstep meant a 1,000-foot fall, hidden crevasses that could swallow a man without trace, creek crossings where the current ran swift and cold enough to kill within minutes. It would test the limits of his aging body, but it would test his pursuers even more severely. By mid-morning, Eli had gathered his essential gear and prepared to abandon his sanctuary. He felt a pang of loss as he looked around the cave that had sheltered him through the night. This might be the last time he'd see his valley, his cabin, the life he'd built in peaceful isolation. But McKinnon's compass seemed to pull at him with invisible force, its needle pointing toward destiny. "Come on, Buck," he whispered, shouldering his pack. "Time to see if we remember how to disappear." They moved like ghosts through the morning shadows, using game trails and natural cover to mask their progress. Eli's knowledge of wildlife patterns served him well. He knew where deer would be drinking at this hour, which paths elk preferred for their morning feeding, how to move through the forest without disturbing the natural rhythms that might alert observant watchers. It took 2 hours to reach the point where Eli's trail began its descent toward the more dangerous terrain. From this vantage point, he could see his pursuers had finally realized their quarry had escaped. One man remained at the cabin, while the other two began following Eli's deliberately obvious tracks toward the north. Eli smiled grimly. He'd left those tracks on purpose, leading his hunters toward a series of switchbacks that would slow them down while he took a more direct but hazardous route to the valley floor. By the time they realized they'd been fooled, he'd have a significant head start. The descent tested every skill he'd developed during his mountain years. Loose shale threatened to send him tumbling with each step, while icy patches from the previous night's frost made solid footing treacherous. Buck proved his worth repeatedly, scouting ahead and alerting Eli to dangers that might not be visible from above. As they worked their way down the mountainside, Eli found himself thinking about the last conversation he'd had with McKinnon. They'd been planning the next day's investigation, organizing evidence and preparing for what they'd hoped would be the breakthrough that exposed the entire corruption network. "Justice isn't just about punishment, son," McKinnon had said that night. "It's about setting things right, making sure the scales balance again. Sometimes that takes longer than we'd like. But truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Now, 15 years later, truth was indeed surfacing, literally, in the form of McKinnon's remains and that impossible journal. Maybe the sheriff had been right about justice finding its own timeline. Maybe some fights were worth waiting for, as long as they eventually got fought. The compass in Eli's pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step downward, its pull towards Cedar Ridge becoming harder to ignore. Whatever waited for him in the town he'd abandoned, whatever dangers and revelations lay ahead, Eli was finally ready to face them. The mountain had been his teacher and his sanctuary. Now it was time to graduate to a different kind of classroom. The silver locket lay in Eli's palm like a piece of his broken heart made tangible. He'd found it wrapped in oiled cloth among McKinnon's scattered remains, protected from the elements that had claimed everything else. The delicate engraving on its surface was still visible despite the years, tiny roses intertwined with Sarah's initials, SMW, for Sarah Margaret Whitmore. Eli's fingers trembled as he opened the locket's clasp. Inside, exactly as he remembered, was a small photograph of Sarah taken just months before she'd left Cedar Ridge. Her dark hair was pulled back in the modest style appropriate for a schoolteacher, but her eyes held the warmth and intelligence that had captured his heart so completely. On the opposite side of the locket, pressed flat against the gold, was a tiny pressed flower, a mountain lupine, one of the wildflowers from their secret meadow. He'd given her this locket for her birthday in the spring of 1883, spending most of his deputy's wages on the finest piece he could afford from the jewelry store in Cheyenne. She'd worn it every day until the threat started, until fear had driven her away from everything they'd built together. But why was it here, buried with McKinnon's remains? How had his mentor come to possess Sarah's most precious piece of jewelry? Buck whined softly from his position by the creek where they'd stopped to rest. They'd successfully evaded their pursuers and made good time down the mountain, but the descent had taken its toll on both of them. Eli's knees ached from the constant strain of navigating treacherous terrain, while Buck favored his left front paw from an encounter with sharp granite. The locket seemed to pulse with memories as Eli held it to the morning light, Sarah's laughter echoing across mountain meadows, her gentle corrections of his grammar during their evening conversations, the way she'd looked at him when he'd first pinned the deputy's star to his vest, pride mixed with worry, love tempered by the knowledge that his job would always carry danger. "I'm not built for a safe life, Eli," she told him once. "But I'm not sure I'm built for constant fear either." Those words made sense now, in a way they hadn't 15 years ago. Sarah hadn't been rejecting him. She'd been wrestling with her own courage, trying to find the strength to stand beside a man whose dedication to justice made him a target for powerful enemies. The journal had revealed that she'd been receiving threats, sophisticated intimidation designed to make her understand exactly how vulnerable she was. Someone had been watching her, learning her routines, documenting her weaknesses. The message had been clear: stay with Eli and pay the consequences. As Eli studied the photograph in the locket, another memory surfaced with painful clarity. 3 days before Sarah had announced her decision to leave, she'd asked him a question that had seemed strange at the time. "If something happened to me, Eli, what would you do?" He'd laughed off her concern, assuring her that nothing would happen, that he and McKinnon would protect her from any threat. But her expression had remained serious, almost desperate. "Promise me something," she'd said. "If I ever leave for any reason, promise me you won't let it destroy you. Promise me you'll remember that some things are more important than any one person's happiness." At the time, he'd thought she was being unnecessarily dramatic. Now he understood she'd been trying to prepare him for what she saw as the only choice that might keep them both alive. Buck limped over and settled beside him, offering the comfort of warm companionship. Eli scratched the dog's ears while studying the terrain ahead. They were still several miles from Cedar Ridge, traveling through country that had changed little since his deputy days. The same rocky outcroppings provided shelter, the same creek beds offered fresh water, the same game trails wound through forests that seemed untouched by time. But Eli himself had changed dramatically. The man who'd fled this country had been young, idealistic, crushed by what felt like betrayal and failure. The man returning was older, harder, tempered by years of surviving in an environment that forgave no weaknesses. The mountains had stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only the essential elements of his character. That character was being tested now as memories flooded back with each familiar landmark. Here was the ridge where he'd first kissed Sarah, under a canopy of stars that had seemed to promise infinite possibilities. There was the creek where he and McKinnon had watered their horses during long patrols, discussing cases and planning strategies for maintaining order in their territory. Every mile brought fresh pain, but also fresh determination. The locket was proof that Sarah's departure hadn't been a simple rejection. It was evidence of a much more complex tragedy. If McKinnon had died protecting her memory, if she'd sacrificed their future to keep Eli alive, then the very least he could do was finish the work they'd all paid so dearly to begin. The morning sun climbed higher as they continued their journey toward Cedar Ridge. Eli moved with the patient endurance the mountains had taught him, covering ground steadily, but without the urgency that might lead to careless mistakes. Buck matched his pace despite his injured paw. alert for dangers that might threaten their mission. As they crested a ridge that offered their first distant view of Cedar Ridge, Eli was struck by how much the town had grown. What had been a modest settlement of perhaps 300 souls was now a proper community of substantial buildings and established streets. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and the gleam of new construction was visible even from several miles away. Progress had clearly come to Cedar Ridge, but Eli wondered what kind of progress it had been. Growth funded by corruption and built on the graves of honest men. Prosperity that came at the cost of justice denied and crimes unpunished. The locket seemed to grow heavier in his pocket as these thoughts circled through his mind. Sarah had believed in the possibility of bringing civilization to the frontier, real civilization, built on law and education, and the hope that people could be better than their worst impulses. Had her sacrifice been for nothing? Had the corruption they'd fought so hard to expose simply adapted and grown stronger? Only one way to find out. Eli tucked the locket safely away and shouldered his pack. The journey to Cedar Ridge would take most of the day, but he was no longer in a hurry. 15 years of waiting demanded that the final approach be done carefully, thoughtfully, with the patience McKinnon had tried to teach him during those long-ago deputy days. "Come on, Buck," he said quietly. "Time to see what kind of town they've built on McKinnon's grave." The dog fell into step beside him, and together they began the final descent toward a reckoning that was 15 years overdue. McKinnon's deputy star felt different from the badge Eli had carried all those years ago. Heavier somehow, weighted with the authority of a man who died pursuing justice. The silver was tarnished black in places, and one point had been bent slightly, probably during whatever struggle had preceded McKinnon's death. But the essential shape remained intact, and when Eli rubbed away the grime with his thumb, the metal beneath still held its original luster. He'd found the star pinned inside McKinnon's vest, positioned over where his heart would have been. Unlike the sheriff's badge they discovered initially, this was McKinnon's personal deputy star from his early days in law enforcement, before his promotion to sheriff. Eli remembered McKinnon showing it to him once, explaining how he'd kept it as a reminder of where he'd started. "And proof that every lawman began as someone's student. Never forget you're still learning, son," McKinnon had said that day. "The moment you think you know everything about justice is the moment you stop serving it properly." Now, as Eli made his way down familiar trails toward Cedar Ridge, those words carried new weight. 15 years of mountain living had taught him patience and observation, skills that might serve him better than the righteous anger that had once driven his pursuit of justice. Perhaps McKinnon's final lesson was waiting to be learned. The descent through country he'd once patrolled regularly brought back a flood of memories, each landmark triggering recollections of cases solved and criminals apprehended. Here was the creek where he'd cornered horse thieves who'd thought the rushing water would cover their tracks. There was the rocky outcrop where he'd waited all night to arrest a claim jumper who'd been terrorizing local prospectors. In those days, the work had seemed straightforward. Bad men did bad things, and good lawmen stopped them. The corruption investigation that had destroyed his world had been his first encounter with the kind of evil that wore respectable clothes and hid behind legitimate authority. McKinnon had tried to prepare him for that complexity, but Eli had been too young and too idealistic to truly understand the warning. "Some criminals are easier to catch than others," McKinnon had explained during one of their evening strategy sessions. "A man who steals horses doesn't pretend to be anything but a thief. But a man who steals from the community while serving on its council, that kind of criminal is protected by people's need to believe in their leaders." Buck moved carefully beside him, still favoring his injured paw, but maintaining the steady pace that would get them to Cedar Ridge by late afternoon. The dog's alertness never wavered, ears constantly moving to track sounds that might indicate danger. His mountain-honed instincts were proving invaluable as they moved through territory that might hold both old friends and new enemies. As they walked, Eli found himself remembering specific details of the corruption investigation that had cost McKinnon his life. The case had begun simply enough. $2,000 in territorial gold that had vanished between the mining office and the bank. But as they dug deeper, the connections had spread like cracks in winter ice, revealing a network of crime that infected every level of local authority. The pivotal moment had come when they discovered that the missing gold was just one small piece of a much larger operation. For years, a group of supposedly respectable citizens had been systematically stealing from territorial improvement funds, skimming money meant for roads, schools, and public safety. They'd sold information to cattle rustlers, taken bribes to ignore mining claim disputes, and even arranged for evidence to disappear in cases that threatened their associates. At the center of it all was Councilman James Hartwell, a man whose public reputation for civic responsibility masked a criminal mind of remarkable sophistication. He'd built his network carefully, recruiting accomplices through a combination of bribes, blackmail, and shared guilt. By the time Eli and McKinnon had begun to understand the scope of his operation, Hartwell controlled judges, bank officials, and even some territorial appointees in Cheyenne. The deputy star in Eli's hand seemed to pulse with the weight of that unfinished investigation. McKinnon had been methodical in building his case, collecting evidence with the patience of a man who understood that prosecuting powerful criminals required absolute proof. He'd hidden documentation in multiple locations, created backup copies of crucial testimony, and established a network of informants who could provide first-hand accounts of criminal activity. But somewhere in that careful process, McKinnon had made a mistake that cost him his life. Maybe he'd trusted the wrong person, or investigated too openly, or simply underestimated how far Hartwell would go to protect his empire. The result had been McKinnon's disappearance and the collapse of everything they'd worked so hard to build. As Eli continued his journey towards Cedar Ridge, he found himself analyzing that long-ago investigation with the perspective that 15 years and hard-won wisdom provided. McKinnon's mistake hadn't been in pursuing justice. It had been in assuming that justice could be achieved through conventional means. When you were fighting an enemy who controlled the very institutions meant to enforce law and order, you needed different tactics. The mountains had taught Eli about patience, about waiting for the right moment to act, about the importance of understanding your environment before making your move. Those lessons might prove more valuable than all his formal law enforcement training when it came to finishing McKinnon's work. Buck suddenly stopped, ears pricked forward and body tense. Eli immediately crouched, using hand signals to move the dog behind cover while he scanned the trail ahead. After 15 years of partnership, he trusted Buck's senses more than his own when it came to detecting potential threats. There, movement in the trees about 50 yards ahead, too deliberate to be wildlife. Someone was watching the trail, positioned to observe anyone approaching Cedar Ridge from this direction. Eli settled in to study the situation, calling on skills that had kept him alive during his mountain years. The watcher was good, well concealed and disciplined in his movements. But Eli had spent 15 years learning to spot the subtle signs that distinguished human presence from natural forest rhythms. A branch that moved against the wind, a shadow that held too still, the barely visible glint of metal or glass. All indicators that someone was trying very hard not to be seen. This wasn't one of the men who'd been watching his cabin. This was someone else, positioned to intercept anyone approaching Cedar Ridge from the high country. The implications were troubling. How many people knew about his possible return? How extensive was the network watching for his arrival? Eli made his decision with the careful deliberation that mountain life had taught him. Rather than confront the watcher directly, he would use his knowledge of the terrain to bypass this surveillance point entirely. There were other ways to approach Cedar Ridge, routes that only someone with his intimate knowledge of the local geography would know. As he and Buck began their careful withdrawal from the watched trail, Eli reflected on how the investigation that had once seemed so straightforward had become something far more complex and dangerous. But complexity was just another kind of terrain to navigate, and he'd become very good at reading difficult country. The coded map, hidden within McKinnon's journal, was a masterpiece of careful planning disguised as casual notation. To any casual observer, the seemingly random marks scattered throughout the journal's margins looked like nothing more than a distracted man's idle doodling. But Eli recognized the pattern immediately. It was based on a system McKinnon had taught him for marking evidence locations during complex investigations. Each symbol corresponded to a specific type of cache: financial documents, witness testimony, physical evidence, or backup copies of crucial materials. The map covered an area spanning 3 counties, with locations marked everywhere, from abandoned mine shafts to hollow trees to caves that only locals would know existed. McKinnon had been far more thorough than Eli had ever realized, creating a comprehensive network of evidence that could rebuild their entire investigation from scratch. Using a piece of charcoal from their coal camp, Eli carefully copied the relevant sections of the map onto a piece of bark. The nearest cache was less than 2 miles from his current position, hidden in a rock formation that he remembered from his deputy days. If McKinnon's system had survived 15 years of weather and wildlife, it might contain the breakthrough evidence they'd never managed to gather during their original investigation. Buck's paw was healing well. The dog's natural resilience, aided by mountain herbs Eli had learned to identify during his years of isolation. They moved carefully through terrain that felt both familiar and strange. Familiar in its basic geography, strange in the subtle changes that 15 years had brought to the forest. New game trails had been established, old ones had faded, and the very trees seemed different in ways that spoke to the passage of time. As they approached Cedar Ridge through the backcountry route Eli had chosen, the first thing that struck him was the sound. The quiet frontier town, he remembered, had been replaced by something much busier. The ring of hammers, the creak of wagon wheels, the distant whistle of what sounded like a steam engine. Progress had indeed come to Cedar Ridge, but Eli found himself wondering what kind of progress it represented. From his concealed vantage point on the ridge overlooking the town, Eli studied the changes that 15 years had brought. The main street had been widened and planked, with substantial wooden sidewalks replacing the muddy paths he remembered. New buildings lined both sides of the thoroughfare: a proper hotel, an expanded bank, what looked like a railroad depot at the eastern edge of town. The population had clearly tripled, maybe quadrupled, transforming Cedar Ridge from a rough frontier settlement into a genuine community. But as Eli observed the town's daily rhythm through his field glasses, disturbing patterns began to emerge. The new prosperity was unevenly distributed. While some buildings displayed fresh paint and modern fixtures, others showed signs of neglect that suggested their owners lacked the resources for maintenance. More troubling was the behavior of certain individuals who moved through the town, with the confidence of men who knew they were beyond ordinary accountability. James Hartwell was still alive, still in power, and apparently more influential than ever. Eli spotted him emerging from the bank in the company of 2 other men he recognized from the old days: Councilman Bradley and Judge Morrison, both of whom had been suspected but never proven participants in the original corruption network. They moved with the easy authority of men who controlled their environment, greeting selected citizens with calculated warmth while ignoring others entirely. The most revealing moment came when Eli observed a confrontation between one of Hartwell's associates and a shopkeeper who appeared to be behind on some kind of payment. The conversation was brief and one-sided, with the shopkeeper's body language clearly indicating fear rather than simple business disagreement. When it ended, the man disappeared into his store and didn't emerge again. During the 2 hours Eli maintained his observation, this wasn't the natural growth of a frontier community, finding its footing in the modern world. This was a town controlled by men who used fear and economic leverage to maintain their authority. Exactly the kind of systematic corruption that McKinnon had died trying to expose. Buck whined softly and nudged Eli's elbow, drawing attention to movement in the tree line below their position. 3 riders were approaching Cedar Ridge from the south, moving with the purposeful urgency of men carrying important news. Eli adjusted his field glasses and felt his blood chill as he recognized the lead rider, one of the men who'd been watching his cabin. The implications were immediate and threatening. His pursuers had given up the mountain search and were reporting back to their employers in Cedar Ridge. Within hours, possibly minutes, the entire network would know that Eli Rourke had escaped their surveillance and was presumably heading toward town. The advantage of surprise, which had been his primary tactical asset, was about to disappear. But perhaps that wasn't entirely a disadvantage. 15 years ago, Eli and McKinnon had been forced to operate within the constraints of official law enforcement, following procedures and respecting jurisdictional boundaries that their enemies used as shields. Now Eli was free to adopt different tactics, the kind of unconventional approach that mountain living had taught him to appreciate. The coded map in his possession represented something unprecedented, a complete guide to evidence that could rebuild the corruption case from the ground up, hidden in locations that only McKinnon had known about. If even half of those caches had survived, Eli would have access to documentation and testimony that could expose the entire criminal network. More importantly, he was no longer the idealistic young deputy who'd relied on official channels and proper procedures. 15 years of surviving in an environment where mistakes meant death had taught him patience, planning, and the importance of understanding your enemy's weaknesses before revealing your own strength. As the 3 riders disappeared into Cedar Ridge, Eli made his decision. Rather than entering the town directly, he would first recover what evidence he could from McKinnon's hidden caches. Armed with that knowledge, he could approach the final confrontation with the kind of preparation that his mentor had never been able to complete. Buck seemed to sense the change in his master's intention, the shift from reconnaissance to active engagement. The dog's tail wagged once, briefly, and his alert stance indicated readiness for whatever challenge lay ahead. McKinnon was always telling me that patience was a lawman's greatest weapon, Eli murmured, as he carefully folded the map and prepared to leave their observation post. Took me 15 years to understand what he meant. But I think I'm finally ready to put that lesson to use. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades that reminded Eli of Sarah's favorite dress. Somewhere in the town below, the men who'd ordered her death and McKinnon's murder were conducting business as usual. Confident that their crimes would remain forever buried, they were about to discover how wrong they were. Sarah's wedding ring lay among McKinnon's carefully preserved possessions, like a knife through Eli's heart. The simple gold band was exactly as he remembered it, the ring he'd saved for months to buy, the symbol of a future they'd planned together before everything fell apart. But seeing it here, wrapped in oiled cloth alongside documents and evidence, transformed 15 years of painful assumptions into something far more devastating. Sarah hadn't left him. She hadn't chosen safety over love, civilization over frontier life. She'd been murdered, and McKinnon had known the truth. Eli's hands shook as he opened the leather portfolio that had protected the ring and its accompanying documentation. McKinnon's careful handwriting detailed a sequence of events that rewrote everything Eli thought he understood about his past. September 20th, 1883. Sarah. Whitmore's body discovered in Willow Creek, approximately 3 miles downstream from the schoolhouse. Official cause of death listed as accidental drowning, but evidence suggests otherwise. Bruising on her wrists consistent with restraint. No water in her lungs. She was dead before entering the creek. September 21st, 1883, confronted Doc Brennan about his examination. He admits to falsifying the death certificate under pressure from prominent citizens who threatened his practice and his family. Sarah had been strangled before her body was placed in the water to simulate drowning. September 22nd, 1883. Discovered. Sarah's real purpose for visiting me on September 17th. She hadn't come just to discuss threats against herself. She'd been conducting her own investigation into the corruption network. As the town's schoolteacher, she had access to the homes of every prominent family in Cedar Ridge. She'd been copying documents, recording conversations, gathering evidence that we never knew existed. The revelation hit Eli like a physical blow. While he and McKinnon had been methodically building their case through official channels, Sarah had been conducting a parallel investigation using her unique position in the community. Her access to the social circles where the real decisions were made had given her insights that no lawman could have obtained. September 23rd, 1883. Recovered Sarah's hidden evidence from the schoolhouse. Her documentation proves direct involvement by Judge Morrison, Bank President Fletcher, and at least 6 members of the town council in the territorial gold theft. More damaging, she had recorded evidence of their plans to eliminate anyone who threatened their operation. September 24th, 1883. Sarah's final conversation with me now makes terrible sense. She knew they were planning to kill her. Her decision to leave Eli wasn't rejection. It was a desperate attempt to protect him by removing herself as leverage against him. She believed that if she disappeared, the threats against him would cease. She was wrong. Eli had to stop reading as the full weight of the truth settled into his consciousness. Sarah had died not as an innocent victim caught in the crossfire of their investigation, but as an active participant in the fight for justice. Her sacrifice hadn't been motivated by fear or weakness. It had been the calculated decision of a brave woman trying to protect the man she loved. Buck pressed against his side, offering wordless comfort as Eli struggled to process this recontextualization of his entire adult life. The guilt he'd carried for 15 years, the certainty that his dedication to justice had cost him the woman he loved, was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what had actually happened. September 25th, 1883. Final entry before my own planned elimination. The corruption network knows that Sarah gathered enough evidence to destroy them. They also know that I possess that evidence now. Hartwell sent word through intermediaries. Abandon the investigation or face the same fate as Sarah. I've refused, of course. If they kill me, someone will eventually discover our combined evidence and finish what we started. I've told Eli nothing of Sarah's true fate or her heroic work. The boy is barely holding together as it is, and knowledge of the truth would drive him to actions that would only get him killed. Better he should hate me for failing to protect her than die trying to avenge her. If I don't survive the next few days, perhaps someday he'll be older and wiser enough to understand. The final paragraph was written in different ink, probably added just before McKinnon rode out to his death. If anyone finds this record, know that Sarah Whitmore died as surely for justice as any soldier dies for his country. She saw corruption poisoning her community and chose to fight it, knowing the cost might be her life. Honor her memory by finishing what we started. Eli set the documents aside and picked up Sarah's ring, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. All these years, he'd imagined her living safely in some eastern city, perhaps married to a banker or lawyer who could give her the security she'd claimed to want. The reality was infinitely more painful and infinitely more proud. Sarah had been a warrior for justice, just as much as any deputy or sheriff. Her battlefield had been drawing rooms and social gatherings instead of saloons and mining camps, but her courage had been every bit as real. She died not as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but as a hero who'd chosen to stand against evil, even when she knew the likely consequences. The implications for his current situation were staggering. If McKinnon's documentation was accurate, Sarah had gathered evidence that went far beyond anything he and the sheriff had managed to collect through official channels. Her social position had given her access to private conversations, financial records, and planning sessions that revealed the corruption network's true scope and methods. But more importantly, her murder had been motivated by fear. The conspirators hadn't killed her as a warning to McKinnon and Eli. They'd killed her because she'd discovered something so damaging that they couldn't risk it becoming public knowledge. That suggested their crimes went far beyond simple theft and bribery, into territory that would bring federal intervention if exposed. As evening settled over the mountains, Eli carefully repacked Sarah's ring and McKinnon's documentation. The grief was overwhelming, but underneath it burned a cold fury that felt as clean and pure as mountain air. For 15 years, he'd been carrying the wrong burden. His dedication to justice hadn't cost him the woman he loved. It had made him worthy of a woman who died fighting the same battle. The men who'd ordered Sarah's death were still alive, still in power, still profiting from the corruption that had cost two good people their lives. They'd grown comfortable in their impunity, confident that their secrets would remain buried forever. Tomorrow, Eli would begin the process of proving them wrong. Tonight, he would honor Sarah's memory by reading every word of the evidence she died to gather, understanding at last the true scope of the fight she'd joined. Buck settled beside him as Eli began studying the documents by lamplight. The dog's presence a comfort as his master prepared for the battle that would finally bring justice to the dead. The mountain wind carried the scent of coming snow, but Eli felt only the burning clarity of purpose that had eluded him for 15 years. Sarah and McKinnon had started this fight. Now it was time for him to finish it. McKinnon's hidden arsenal was a testament to a lawman's foresight and a soldier's preparation. Buried beneath carefully arranged stones in a cave that few people even knew existed, the cache contained enough weapons and ammunition to outfit a small army, along with the kind of evidence that could topple governments. Eli knelt beside the open strongbox, marveling at his mentor's thoroughness, even as his heart ached for the paranoia that had driven such extensive preparations. 3 rifles, 4 handguns, and enough ammunition to sustain a prolonged siege. But more important than the weapons were the documents, ledgers, correspondence, sworn testimonies, and financial records that painted a picture of corruption far more extensive than Eli had ever imagined. McKinnon hadn't just been investigating the theft of territorial gold. He'd uncovered a criminal network that reached into federal government contracts, railroad land grants, and territorial appointments. As Eli studied the evidence by lamplight, patterns emerged that revealed the true scope of what Sarah and McKinnon had died fighting. The corruption network wasn't just stealing money. They were systematically undermining the rule of law itself, creating a shadow government that operated according to its own brutal logic. Federal funds meant for territorial development had been diverted into private accounts. Land grants had been awarded to cronies who immediately sold them to railroad companies for massive profits. Even judicial appointments had been bought and sold like commodities. At the center of it all was James Hartwell, but the documents revealed he was far from an independent operator. The corruption network extended to territorial officials in Cheyenne, federal bureaucrats in Washington, and railroad executives who viewed the frontier as nothing more than a source of cheap land and cheaper labor. What had appeared to be local crime was actually part of a coordinated effort to strip wealth from the developing territories while maintaining a facade of legitimate governance. Buck paced restlessly near the cave entrance, alert for any sign that their location had been discovered. The dog's anxiety reflected Eli's own growing awareness that they were facing enemies with resources and reached far beyond anything a small-town deputy had been trained to handle. This wasn't just about bringing a few corrupt officials to justice. It was about exposing a system of organized crime that operated at the highest levels of territorial government. But the evidence also revealed something else. The network's greatest weakness was its complexity. So many people were involved, so many crimes had been committed across so many jurisdictions that the conspirators lived in constant fear of discovery. Sarah's murder hadn't been an act of strength, it had been an act of desperation by men who knew their entire operation. could collapse if the right evidence reached the right people. The question was how to get that evidence to authorities who weren't already compromised. The territorial courts were clearly unreliable, given that several judges were documented participants in the conspiracy. Federal marshals might be trustworthy, but reaching them would require surviving long enough to make contact, and the network's reach into federal bureaucracy made even that option uncertain. As Eli pondered his options, he heard the soft sound of approaching footsteps outside the cave. Buck's ears pricked forward, but his tail wagged. The approaching visitor was someone the dog recognized as friendly. A moment later, a familiar voice called softly from the darkness, "Deputy Rourke, it's Thomas McKinnon. I think it's time we talked." Eli's blood chilled. Thomas McKinnon, Sheriff McKinnon's son, who would now be in his early 30s. The boy had been perhaps 15 when Eli left Cedar Ridge, already showing signs of the intelligence and moral courage that had defined his father. But was he friend or enemy? Had the corruption network recruited him, or was he another potential ally in this impossible fight? "Come in slowly," Eli called back, his hand resting on the grip of his service weapon. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The man who entered the cave was clearly McKinnon's son. He had his father's height and bearing, the same intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. But where the sheriff had carried himself with the confidence of established authority, Thomas moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate dangerous territory. "I'm a doctor now," Thomas said quietly, showing empty hands before settling cross-legged near the cave entrance. "Been practicing in Cedar Ridge for 8 years, ever since I finished medical school back east. And for 8 years, I've been wondering what really happened to my father." Eli studied the younger man's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. What he saw was grief held under tight control, intelligence sharpened by years of frustration, and something that looked very much like his father's moral courage. "You've been asking dangerous questions," Eli observed. "Not asking them would have been more dangerous," Thomas replied. "To my soul, if not my body. I've watched this town grow rich while good people suffered, seen justice perverted so often that most folks have stopped expecting it. I became a doctor because I wanted to heal people, but you can't heal a community that's poisoned at its source." Over the next hour, Thomas shared what he'd learned during his years of careful investigation. As the town doctor, he'd had access to homes and conversations that revealed the corruption network's true methods. He'd treated the broken bones of shopkeepers who'd fallen behind on their protection payments, tended the wounds of women whose husbands had asked too many questions about municipal contracts, and signed death certificates that he strongly suspected documented murders made to look like accidents. "The worst part," Thomas said, his voice heavy with controlled anger, "is how they've corrupted the very idea of progress. Cedar Ridge has grown, yes, but its growth built on fear and theft. The new buildings, the railroad depot, the expanded businesses, all of it funded by money, stolen from people who trusted their government to serve them honestly." Eli shared McKinnon's documentation with Thomas, watching the younger man's face as he read his father's final entries. The grief was unmistakable, but so was the determination that followed it. "He knew," Thomas whispered after reading the account of Sarah's murder. "He knew they were going to kill him, but he rode out anyway because he believed someone would eventually finish what he started. That someone appears to be us," Eli said quietly. "Question is, are you ready for what that means?" Thomas looked up from the documents, and Eli saw his father's steel in the younger man's eyes. "I've been ready for 8 years. The question is whether we can do this without becoming the same kind of criminals we're fighting." It was a fair question, and one that Eli had been wrestling with since discovering the truth about Sarah's death. The corruption network had operated with impunity for 15 years because they'd been willing to use methods that honest men hesitated to employ. Murder, intimidation, blackmail, all tools that good people found morally repugnant, but which had proven devastatingly effective. "Your father taught me that justice isn't about winning fights," Eli said after a long moment. "It's about making sure the fights are fair ones. We don't have to become killers to beat killers, but we do have to be smarter and more prepared than they are. Together, they began planning what Thomas called the Reckoning, a coordinated effort to expose the corruption network using the evidence that McKinnon and Sarah had died together. The plan was ambitious and dangerous, requiring precise timing and absolute trust between men who barely knew each other. They would simultaneously present evidence to federal authorities in 3 different locations: Cheyenne, Denver, and Washington, making it impossible for the conspiracy to suppress all the revelations. Thomas would use his medical practices, connections to reach a federal judge he believed to be honest, while Eli would personally deliver documentation to a U as marshal, whose reputation suggested integrity. But first, they needed to gather additional evidence that would tie current crimes to the historical documentation. The corruption network had evolved over 15 years, and prosecutors would need proof of recent criminal activity to build a compelling case. "There's a territorial audit happening next week," Thomas explained. "Federal accountants coming to review Cedar Ridge's books as part of a routine evaluation. If we can get evidence of current theft to those auditors, combined with the historical documentation, it might be enough to trigger a full federal investigation." The plan was risky. It required them to operate in Cedar Ridge itself, gathering evidence under the noses of men who'd already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets. But it was also their best chance to achieve the kind of comprehensive justice that would honor the memory of everyone who died fighting this corruption. As dawn approached, Eli and Thomas made their final preparations. The weapons from McKinnon's cache were cleaned and loaded, escape routes were planned and memorized, and contingency plans were established for when, not if, their activities were discovered. Buck stretched and yawned, ready for whatever the day might bring. The dog had bonded quickly with Thomas, recognizing in the younger McKinnon the same steady reliability that had defined his father. "One more thing," Thomas said, as they prepared to leave the cave. "There's something else my father would have wanted you to know. Sarah Whitmore, she asked me to give you a message if anything happened to her. I was just a boy then, but I remembered." Eli's breath caught. "What message?" she said. "To tell you that love isn't about being safe together, it's about being brave together. She said you'd understand what that meant when you were ready." As they made their way through the pre-dawn darkness toward Cedar Ridge, Eli finally understood what Sarah had been trying to tell him. Love wasn't about finding shelter from the storm. It was about standing together against the forces that threatened everything you held dear. Today, he would honor that understanding by finishing the fight that had cost them both so much. The original territorial gold gleamed in the lamplight like accumulated sin made manifest, hidden beneath the foundation of Cedar Ridge's town hall. For 15 years, the stolen treasure had literally become the cornerstone upon which the entire corruption network had built its empire. $2,000 in gold dust and nuggets, the theft that had started McKinnon's investigation and cost him his life, had been sitting directly under the feet of the men who'd murdered him. Eli ran his fingers through the precious metal, feeling its weight and understanding at last why Sarah and McKinnon had died. This wasn't just evidence of theft. It was proof of the corruption network's fundamental arrogance. They'd been so confident in their power, so certain of their impunity, that they'd hidden their first major crime in the most public location possible. They wanted it where they could see it every day, Thomas whispered from his position by the basement entrance. A reminder of how much they could steal and still maintain their respectable facades. The discovery had been Thomas's insight based on childhood memories of watching town meetings where his father had pressed officials about the missing gold. Young Thomas had noticed how Councilman Hartwell always seemed to know exactly where he was standing during those confrontations, how he positioned himself in specific spots in the hall with an almost ritualistic precision. He was standing on it, Thomas had realized just hours earlier. Every time my father accused him of theft, Hartwell was literally standing on the evidence of his crime. Getting access to the town hall's basement had required all of Eli's mountain-honed skills and Thomas's intimate knowledge of the building's layout. They'd waited until the federal auditors had finished their evening session, then used a combination of stealth and legitimate access. Thomas often treated town employees and had reason to visit the building to reach the foundation area where the gold lay hidden. But finding the gold was only the beginning. Their larger plan required simultaneous execution across multiple fronts, and the clock was ticking toward the moment when their activities would inevitably be discovered. Above them, the sounds of the town hall's normal evening routine continued. Night watchmen making their rounds, late-working clerks finishing reports, the general bustle of a municipal building winding down for the day. But Eli and Thomas both knew their window of opportunity was closing fast. The corruption network had grown suspicious in the days since Eli's escape from his mountain watchers. Increased patrols throughout the territory, unexpected changes in municipal schedules, and a general atmosphere of heightened alertness all suggested that the conspirators were preparing for some kind of confrontation. "We need to move the gold now," Eli murmured, loading the precious metal into canvas bags they'd brought for the purpose. "Once the auditors see this tomorrow, there won't be any way for Hartwell to explain it away." Thomas nodded, but his expression was troubled. "The question is whether we can get it to the auditors without being intercepted. Hartwell has men watching every approach to the federal offices." That was the critical challenge they faced. The territorial auditors were honest men, but they were also operating in enemy territory, surrounded by officials and lawmen who were either corrupt themselves or intimidated into cooperation. Getting evidence to them required bypassing an entire network of surveillance and obstruction. Eli hefted one of the gold-filled bags, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility that had driven him 15 years ago. But this time, he wasn't. The idealistic young deputy who'd believed that justice could be achieved through proper channels and institutional procedures. Mountain living had taught him patience, planning, and the importance of understanding your enemy's weaknesses before revealing your own strength. "Buck's going to earn his keep tonight," Eli said, scratching the dog's ears as he made his final preparations. "He knows ways through this town that humans never think to watch." The plan they'd developed was audacious in its simplicity. While Eli transported the gold to the federal auditors through a route that avoided all the normal surveillance points, Thomas would simultaneously present McKinnon's documentary evidence to the federal judge who'd arrived with the audit team. Two different types of evidence delivered to two different authorities, making it impossible for the corruption network to suppress both revelations. But as they prepared to leave the town hall basement, the sound of approaching footsteps froze them both in place. Multiple sets of boots, moving with the purposeful coordination of men who knew exactly where they were going. "They know we're here," Thomas whispered, his hand moving instinctively toward the medical bag that concealed his father's service weapon. Eli listened to the footsteps, counting at least 4 different sets and recognizing the disciplined movement patterns of professional enforcers. Somehow, despite all their precautions, the corruption network had discovered their location and was moving to intercept them. The basement had only one entrance, and that was clearly being sealed off by their enemies. But Eli had spent 15 years learning that most situations offered more options than were immediately apparent. "The old mine shaft," he said quietly, remembering the geological surveys he'd studied during his deputy days. "This whole area was undermined before the town was built. There should be access tunnels running under most of the main buildings." Thomas's eyes lit with understanding. His medical practice had given him reason to study the town's layout extensively, including the historical records that documented Cedar Ridge's evolution from mining camp to municipal center. "The old assay office," he confirmed. "The tunnel should connect to the basement of what's now the federal building." As the footsteps above them multiplied and the sound of systematic searching began, Eli and Thomas moved toward their desperate gamble, carrying stolen gold through abandoned mineshafts to reach the federal authorities who represented their only hope for justice. Sarah's final letter trembled in Eli's hands as he read her words by the flickering light of their makeshift torch. The aged paper had been hidden in the one place the corruption network would never think to search, sealed inside the medical kit that Thomas carried as the town doctor. Sarah had given it to him when he was just a boy, with instructions to deliver it only if both she and his father were dead, and someone came looking for the truth. My dearest Eli, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened and I am gone. I pray that you have found your way to justice at last, and that these words will give you the strength to finish what we started together. I need you to know that every moment we shared was real, every promise we made was true, and every dream we built together remains worth fighting for. I did not leave because I stopped loving you. I am leaving because I love you too much to let them use me as a weapon against you. By the time you read this, you will know about my investigation into the corruption that has poisoned our community. What you may not know is that it was your dedication to justice that inspired me to take action. Watching you and Sheriff McKinnon fight for what was right showed me that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else is more important than fear. The letter continued, but Eli had to pause as emotion threatened to overwhelm him. They were hiding in the abandoned mineshaft beneath Cedar Ridge, the stolen gold at their feet and the sound of pursuit echoing through the tunnels behind them. Above, the corruption network's enforcers were systematically searching every building in town, closing the net around them with professional efficiency. But Sarah's words gave him the strength he needed to continue reading. I have gathered evidence that will destroy them, but only if it reaches the right hands. The territorial judges cannot be trusted. Too many are part of the conspiracy. Federal authorities are our only hope, but they must receive not just evidence of theft, but proof of murder. The men we are fighting will kill anyone who threatens them, and they must be held accountable for those crimes. I know they will kill me for what I have discovered, just as they plan to kill Sheriff McKinnon and eventually you. But death is not defeat if it serves justice. Remember what you told me about your father's sacrifice in the mine. Some things are worth dying for because they make life possible for others. Buck whined softly from his position, watching the tunnel entrance, alerting them to approaching footsteps. The corruption network's men had found the entrance to the mine shaft and were beginning their pursuit through the underground passages. We need to move, Thomas whispered urgently. The federal building is still half a mile through these tunnels. But Eli continued reading, understanding that Sarah's final words contained something essential to completing their mission. The most important thing I have learned is this. Hartwell and his associates are not just thieves, they are murderers who have killed federal officials, territorial appointees, and anyone else who threatened their operation. Judge Patterson didn't die of a heart attack, he was poisoned. Marshal Williams didn't fall from his horse, he was shot. At least 6 deaths that were ruled accidental or natural were actually assassinations. I have documented proof of these murders hidden where only someone who truly knows me would think to look. Our secret place in the meadow, beneath the stone where we carved our initials, there you will find testimony that will hang them all. The final paragraph was written in different ink, clearly added at the last moment. I go to my death, knowing that you will survive to see justice done. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more loved than you can imagine. When you finally bring down the men who destroyed our happiness, remember that you do so not for revenge, but for all the innocent people who deserve to live free from fear. Forever yours. Sarah Eli folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his vest, next to his heart. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it was transformed now into something that burned clean and pure. Sarah had died not as a victim but as a warrior, and her sacrifice would not be in vain. The sound of pursuit was getting closer, but Eli felt no fear. He had the evidence needed to destroy the corruption network, the stolen gold, McKinnon's documentation, Sarah's testimony, and now proof of multiple murders that would bring federal investigation regardless of local obstruction. "Thomas," he said quietly, as they prepared to make their final push through the tunnels, "when we reach the federal building, I want you to deliver your father's evidence while I handle the gold. If something happens to me, make sure the authorities know about Sarah's hidden testimony in the meadow." Thomas nodded, understanding that they were approaching the moment when 15 years of patient preparation would finally meet its test. The corruption network had grown powerful by operating in darkness, but darkness could not survive the light of truth. As they began their race through the underground passages toward the federal building, Buck leading the way with his superior night vision, Eli felt Sarah's presence with him as strongly as if she were running beside them. Her love had not died with her body. It had become something eternal, a force for justice that would outlive all the men who had killed her. The final confrontation was waiting above ground, but Eli was ready for it at last. The photograph captured a moment of quiet triumph that spoke to the power of justice, delayed but not denied. Eli stood between Thomas McKinnon and his young family on the steps of the new federal courthouse, Buck sitting proudly at their feet, all of them squinting slightly in the bright Wyoming sunshine. The inscription on the back, written in Thomas's careful hand, read, "New beginnings built on old foundations. Justice for Robert McKinnon and Sarah Whitmore." October 1898. 6 months had passed since that desperate night in the mine tunnels. 6 months since the federal auditors had received evidence that triggered the largest corruption investigation in territorial history. The trials had been swift and decisive once the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. James Hartwell and 11 associates were now serving federal prison sentences, their stolen wealth seized and returned to the territorial treasury. 3 federal judges had been removed from office, and the territorial governor himself had resigned in disgrace. But justice, as Eli had learned, was about more than punishment. It was about healing the wounds that corruption had inflicted on the community. Cedar Ridge was rebuilding itself with the recovered funds, this time under genuine oversight and with the participation of citizens who no longer feared retribution for asking questions. The school that Sarah had dreamed of building was finally under construction, funded by money that had once lined corrupt pockets. A proper memorial to Sheriff McKinnon graced the town square, acknowledging his sacrifice and reminding everyone of the price of freedom from fear. Eli had been offered the sheriff's position, but he declined in favor of something that suited him better. As a federal territorial investigator, he could travel throughout Wyoming and Colorado, helping other communities root out corruption before it took deep hold. The work used all his skills, his mountain wisdom, his law enforcement experience, and his hard-won understanding of how evil disguised itself as respectability. Thomas had proven himself worthy of his father's legacy, becoming not just Cedar Ridge's most trusted doctor, but also a community leader who helped ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. His medical practice flourished, but more importantly, his moral voice provided guidance to a town learning to govern itself. Honestly, the photograph had been taken on the day. They'd finally recovered Sarah's hidden testimony from the meadow where she and Eli had once planned their future. Her documentation of the conspiracy's murders had been perfectly preserved, wrapped in oiled cloth and buried beneath the stone that still bore their carved initials. Federal prosecutors had used her evidence to secure convictions for crimes that would have otherwise gone unpunished forever. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the simplest one. Buck had adapted to town life with surprising ease, becoming a beloved fixture who seemed to understand that his master's calling now required different skills, but the same fundamental dedication to protecting the innocent. Children who had never known life without fear now played freely in streets patrolled by honest lawmen, and Buck had appointed himself their unofficial guardian. As autumn painted the mountains in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Eli found himself standing in the cemetery where McKinnon and Sarah were finally buried with the honor they deserved. Their headstones stood side by side, marking not just their deaths but their contributions to the cause of justice. Fresh flowers appeared regularly, placed by grateful citizens who understood that their freedom had been purchased with the blood of heroes. "They'd be proud of what you've accomplished," Thomas said, joining Eli beside the graves. The younger man carried his medical bag and wore the slightly distracted expression of someone whose services were in constant demand. "What we've accomplished," Eli corrected gently. "None of this would have been possible without your courage and your father's preparations." They stood in comfortable silence, two men who had found brotherhood in shared purpose and mutual respect. The mountain wind carried the scent of snow, promising winter's approach, but Eli no longer felt the isolation he'd once associated with the changing seasons. "Any word on your next assignment?" Thomas asked. Eli nodded toward a letter in his vest pocket. "There's a situation in Colorado that needs investigation. Mining claims disappearing, federal surveyors being intimidated." Sounds familiar. The work would never end, Eli had come to understand. Corruption was like weeds in a garden. It required constant vigilance to prevent it from taking root and choking out everything good. But that didn't make the work futile. It made it necessary. As they walked back toward town, Buck trotting ahead to investigate interesting scents, Eli reflected on the strange turns that life could take. 15 years ago, he'd fled to the mountains as a broken man, convinced that justice was a naive dream and that good people finished last. The mountain had taught him patience, endurance, and the understanding that some fights were worth waiting for. Sarah and McKinnon were gone, but their sacrifice had not been in vain. The corruption network that had seemed so invincible had crumbled when exposed to the light of truth. The town they'd died trying to protect was finally free to grow honestly, and Eli himself had discovered that love and justice were not opposing forces, but complementary ones. Both required the courage to stand against darkness, both demanded sacrifice, and both offered the possibility of redemption. The new photograph would join others in his collection, images that documented not just his personal journey, but the larger truth that evil could be defeated when good people refused to surrender. Each picture told part of the story, but together they formed a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of community, and the enduring strength that came from honoring the memory of those who had fallen in service to justice. As the sun set behind the familiar peaks, Eli Rourke walked toward his next chapter, with Buck at his side and the spirits of his beloved companions lighting his way forward. The mountain had been his teacher and his sanctuary, but his real home was wherever the fight for justice needed to be fought. Some battles, he had learned, were worth a lifetime of dedication, and some victories, however long delayed, were worth any sacrifice required to achieve them.